The mockery and the first notes. The chandeliers of Celeststein dripped light like liquid diamonds, scattering their brilliance across a room filled with velvet chairs, silver cutlery, and wine that cost more per bottle than most families earned in a month. A string quartet in the corner played a graceful waltz, but their music was swallowed by the steady hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, and the clink of glasses raised in endless toasts to fortunes, mergers and victories only the privileged could afford. At the center of this glittering feast sat Lawrence Whitfield, a man who had built an empire of concrete towers and iron gates. His navy suit was cut to perfection, his tie fastened with a pin that glimmered as proudly as his reputation. Around him lounged his circle of wealthy companions, industrialists, developers, and wives adorned in diamonds the size of grapes. Their laughter came easily, too easily, as if the air itself existed to keep them entertained. It was into this world of indulgence and excess that a little girl stepped, her torn dress brushing against polished marble, her tiny hand tightly clutching the smaller fingers of a toddler boy beside her. The boy's cheeks were hollow, his hair uncombed. His stomach growled loud enough that the nearest waiter glanced over before quickly looking away, trained not to notice what the wealthy wished to ignore. The girl's hair, tangled and dull under the chandeliers, tumbled over her shoulders, half concealing her face. Yet when she lifted her head, her eyes, clear, defiant, an ocean blue untainted by grime or fear, cut through the lavish room like shards of glass. She moved forward slowly, her brother dragging his feet with exhaustion, and whispered to the nearest table, her voice trembling yet determined. "Please, my brother is hungry. We haven't eaten since yesterday." The sentence barely carried over the music, but it was enough. A woman in pearls leaned back in disgust, drawing her silk shawl tighter. A man with slicked hair scoffed into his champagne. Conversations at nearby tables paused, some guests frowning in irritation, others pretending not to hear at all. But then came a voice sharp enough to split the murmur like a blade. "Security," a woman in diamonds called. "Remove them. This is not a soup kitchen." Waiters hesitated, unsure whether to act, when Lawrence Whitfield lifted a hand. His smile was not kind. It was the smile of a man who found cruel amusement in others' desperation. He stood, his designer watch catching the crystal glow, and raised his glass, drawing the eyes of half the restaurant. "Wait," he said, his tone dripping with theatrical command. "Don't throw them out just yet." The girl stiffened. Her little brother whimpered softly, clutching her dress tighter. Whitfield's gaze locked on her, the smirk spreading across his lips like oil over water. "If you want supper, little beggar, you'll have to earn it." His words carried across the hall, heavy with mockery. He gestured toward the grand piano that dominated one corner of the restaurant, a magnificent Steinway, black and gleaming like still water beneath the lights. "Play us something. Entertain us. And if you can manage even a decent sound, maybe I'll let you lick the scraps from my plate." A ripple of laughter passed through his table, the sound shallow, cruel, echoing louder than it deserved. The musicians stopped their waltz, their bows frozen mid-air. Every eye shifted to the small girl, who stood frozen under the weight of so many stares. She hugged her brother closer, whispering something soft to calm his hunger, and then looked back at Whitfield. "I'm not a beggar," she said, and though her voice was soft, there was iron hidden beneath it. "My brother is hungry, that's all." The words fell into silence, but Whitfield waved them off with the back of his hand. "Play or leave." And leaving, frankly, would be better for everyone's appetite. The girl's shoulders sagged, as if his words pressed the last of her strength from her. For a moment it seemed she would turn, gather her brother, and walk back into the cold streets outside. But then something flickered in her eyes. Resolve, dignity, a fire that could not be quenched by ridicule. She straightened, chin rising higher than seemed possible for her small frame, and she guided her brother toward the piano. A murmur rolled through the restaurant. "What is she doing? This should be good. Someone stop her before she ruins the Steinway." The manager, Claire Hoffman, froze near the back, her phone clutched in hand. She had been seconds away from calling child services, but the child's composure rooted her where she stood. There was something familiar about the girl. The little one helped her brother climb onto the polished bench, his small legs dangling uselessly above the floor. She seated herself beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly over the ivory keys. For a moment the restaurant held its breath, expecting the clumsy pounding of random notes, the childish noise of a girl who clearly had never touched such an instrument in her life. But when she pressed the first key, the note that rose was not awkward or broken. It hung in the air with delicate purity, as if asking a question no one in the room could answer. Then came the second, soft yet sure, answering the first with quiet determination. By the third note, the room had stilled entirely. The waiters froze in mid-step, glasses half polished, bottles half poured. The quartet, still clutching their instruments, leaned forward in disbelief. The melody unfurled like silk, weaving through the air, filling every corner of the glittering hall. It was haunting, complex, impossibly beautiful. Her small, grimy fingers moved with a grace and speed that defied her years. She was not fumbling. She was commanding. Her brother, once whimpering, now sat wide-eyed, his hunger momentarily forgotten, mesmerized by the music pouring from his sister's hands. "Moonlight Sonata," whispered an elderly patron, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered his glass. "Beethoven!" Gasps rippled across the room. It was a piece that demanded years of training, years of discipline, of teachers and practice and polished halls. Yet here it was, flowing effortlessly from the fingers of a girl no older than 7, her hair uncombed, her dress ragged. Whitfield's smirk faltered. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if trying to catch her trick, some sleight of hand that would expose her fraud. But there was none. The music was too precise, too alive with emotion. This was no trick. This was genius. Claire Hoffman took a step forward, her heart pounding. The girl's profile, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair caught the light. It struck something in her memory. She had seen this face before, not exactly, but in photographs framed on the walls of another world. Her breath caught as realization scraped against the edges of her mind. The girl's song shifted, deepening, as though her soul poured through each note. Pain, hunger, longing, and dignity all tangled into the melody until even the hardest hearts in the room found themselves caught in its grasp. Tears slipped down the cheek of a woman who moments before had sneered at the children. A man lowered his phone, forgetting to record. A silence heavier than any waltz or chatter fell upon Celeste Stein. The girl finished the movement, her final note echoing like a whisper of things lost and things yet to come. For a heartbeat, the room remained still, as if unwilling to breathe lest they shatter the spell she had cast. Then slowly, like thunder rolling in from the distance, applause began. Not polite applause, not the mechanical clap offered to professional performances, but something raw, shaken, reverent. Whitfield did not clap. His face had drained of color. He looked not at the girl but at the letter she pulled from her pocket, placing it gently atop the piano, the seal glinting faintly beneath the chandelier's light. And in that moment he knew the night had shifted in a way he could not control. The girl turned her ocean blue eyes across the stunned restaurant, her small voice carrying further now, clear and steady. "My name is Eleanor Montgomery," she said softly, "and this is my brother James." A glass slipped from a waiter's hand and shattered against the marble floor. The sound rang like a verdict, and for the first time that evening, Lawrence Whitfield had no words. The revelation, the silence that followed the girl's declaration, was almost unbearable. A silence so heavy it pressed against the golden walls and crystal chandeliers as though the very building itself was holding its breath. Eleanor Montgomery, she had said, and for those who had followed the whispers of the city's financial world, that name was more than a child's claim. It was a name long thought buried under tragedy, a name tied to empires of steel and glass, to fortunes sealed away by courts and lawyers, to mysteries that had never found resolution. Guests glanced at one another with pale faces, some too stunned to process what they had just heard, others fumbling with their phones as they frantically searched for images of the Montgomery family, memories of news headlines, and the speculation that had swirled years ago when a yacht carrying the family had gone down off the coast of Italy. Claire Hoffman, the restaurant's manager, felt her pulse thunder in her ears. She remembered the Montgomerys with clarity. Richard and Victoria, pillars of grace who had dined under her care countless times, their generosity as warm as their smiles. She remembered the photographs that once decorated society pages. Victoria with her golden hair and those piercing blue eyes, Richard with his quiet dignity, and their 2 small children who had been presumed lost in the accident that shook the elite world to its core. And now, standing before her, dirty and hungry, Clutching one another for strength were children who bore the same eyes, the same delicate features, the same aura of quiet defiance. The resemblance was undeniable. Whitfield, however, was not so easily convinced. His jaw tightened, his hands curled at his sides, and his composure slipped like sand through fingers. He forced a laugh that rang hollow in the charged air. "Ridiculous," he spat, though the strain in his voice betrayed the cracks beneath. "A clever little scam, that's all this is. Two ragged children wander in off the street, armed with a stolen name and a forged piece of paper, and you fools fall over yourselves to worship them." He sneered at the letter lying on the piano, its embossed seal catching the light like an accusation. "I've handled Montgomery acquisitions for years. I know better than anyone that those children are dead. Everyone knows it. They died with their parents, and yet here we are, listening to fairy tales from a girl who can barely reach the pedals of a piano." But his words did not ripple with confidence as they once had. His companions shifted uneasily in their seats, their earlier laughter now muted into uncertain murmurs. The woman in diamonds who had first called for security now avoided his gaze, her hands clutching her shawl as though to protect herself from the unraveling certainty of the moment. The applause had faded, but the spell of the music lingered in the air, wrapping itself around the girl like armor no insult could pierce. Eleanor did not flinch at Whitfield's outburst. She did not argue or defend herself. She simply reached for her brother's hand, her blue eyes steady, her chin lifted with the same dignity she had carried when she first walked to the piano. "My parents told me in their letter," she said, her voice quiet yet resonant, "that this place was special to them. They said when I was old enough I would understand why. And they told me that everything under this roof, everything that bore their name, would belong to us again. That's why I came here. Not for scraps, not for charity, but because it was theirs, and now it is mine." The ripple that moved through the restaurant this time was not laughter but shock, a rising tide of whispers that filled the space with nervous energy. Waiters stood frozen, holding trays heavy with food no one had the appetite to touch anymore. Guests leaned across tables, some whispering that the girl's eyes were identical to Victoria's, others muttering that this was madness, and still others raising their phones to capture every word, every gesture, eager to share this extraordinary moment with the wider world. Claire finally found her voice, though it trembled as she addressed the child. "Sweetheart," she said softly, taking a step closer. "What letter do you mean?" May I see it?" Eleanor reached into the threadbare coat that hung too loosely from her shoulders and drew out a worn envelope. The paper was creased, smudged with dirt and time, yet the wax seal, though cracked, bore a mark that Claire recognized instantly: the Montgomery crest. A stylized M framed by laurel branches, used only for personal documents of utmost importance. Claire's hand shook as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words written in careful legal script. Each line confirmed what her heart already suspected. It was no forgery. It was a will, a transfer of guardianship, a declaration of assets entrusted to the children once they reached the proper age. At the bottom, in bold signature, was the name of Harold Preston, senior attorney of Preston, Winters and Hall. Claire's breath caught. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. This was real. This was undeniable. "Mr. Whitfield," she called, her voice unsteady but growing firmer as she turned toward him. "I believe you just offered the rightful owner of this restaurant your leftovers." Gasps rippled louder now, some guests covering their mouths, others already capturing the moment on their cameras. The statement cut through Whitfield's bravado like a blade, leaving him exposed and trembling. His eyes burned with fury as he stalked toward the piano, snatching the letter from Claire's hands before she could stop him. He scanned the words, his face reddening with each line, his breathing harsh and uneven. "This is absurd," he snapped, thrusting the paper back at her. "A forgery. A performance designed to humiliate me. You think a child with dirt on her face and holes in her dress can claim billions in assets? No, I refuse to accept this. Call security. Call the police. Call anyone you want, but get them out." But Claire was no longer listening to him. She was already dialing another number on her phone, her hand trembling yet purposeful. "Mr. Preston," she whispered when the call connected. "Yes, this is Claire Hoffman at Celeststein. You need to come immediately. The children, Eleanor and James, they're here. They have the letter." Whitfield froze, the color draining from his face. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Who are you calling?" The Montgomery family attorney, Claire answered, no longer hiding her defiance. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, something cold and certain dawning in her mind. Unlike you, Mr. Whitfield, I actually knew Richard and Victoria. I saw them raise their glasses at that table for 15 years. And I know a face when I see one. That little girl has her mother's eyes. Exactly her mother's eyes. And she even plays like her. Whitfield stumbled back, his carefully crafted mask unraveling as murmurs turned into open accusations, phones recording every flicker of fear across his face. He tried to recover, to raise his chin and scoff once more, but the tide of the room had shifted beyond his control. And then, as if to seal her truth with something no document or lawyer could provide, Eleanor placed her fingers back upon the keys. This time the melody she chose was not Beethoven, but something of her own. A haunting, fragile tune that rose like smoke from a fire too long smothered. It carried sorrow and hope, hunger and dignity, each note a defiance of everything that sought to break her. The room quieted once more, every whisper swallowed by the music of a child who had been mocked, dismissed, ridiculed, but who now commanded the heart of every soul present. Her brother leaned against her, his small eyes closing, soothed at last by the sound he had heard so many nights when they had nothing but each other, and the memory of music to lull them to sleep. And as her melody filled the restaurant, those who had sneered moments before felt tears sting their eyes, though they could not explain why. At the grand entrance of Celeststein, the doors opened. An older man in an immaculate suit, his silver hair slightly disheveled as if he had dressed in haste, stepped inside. His sharp eyes swept the room until they landed on the children at the piano. His face crumpled, his composure breaking as he staggered a step forward. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling with awe. Eleanor stopped playing, her hands resting gently on the keys, and turned toward him with solemn recognition. "Mr. Preston," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years no child should bear, "you look older than your pictures." The entire restaurant gasped, the revelation deepening into something no one had imagined when the night had begun. And Whitfield, once untouchable, now looked like a man standing on the edge of collapse. The proof and the turning tide, the atmosphere inside Celeststein had transformed entirely from the polished arrogance of fine dining into the raw, electric tension of a courtroom. It was no longer laughter and the comfortable chatter of wealth that filled the air, but the steady thrum of anticipation, as though the entire room was waiting for a verdict that would decide the fate of everyone present. Harold Preston, the attorney whose name had echoed in whispers across the most powerful boardrooms in Manhattan, now stood at the center of that stage. He was a man whose very presence carried weight, his career forged through decades of defending legacies and dismantling frauds. But as his eyes found Eleanor and James seated at the grand piano, his controlled composure cracked, and the mask of the polished attorney gave way to raw emotion. He approached slowly, his steps heavy with the burden of disbelief and recognition. His hand trembled as he reached out, but he stopped just short of touching Eleanor's cheek, as though afraid the slightest contact would shatter the fragile reality before him. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, laden with memories and grief. "Eleanor, James, everyone thought you were lost. The sea took your parents, and with them, we believed it had taken you too." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, her chin lifting with that same quiet dignity she had carried since the moment Whitfield mocked her. Her small fingers curled protectively around her brother's hand as she replied, her voice far older than her years. "We were lost, Mr. Preston, but we were not gone. We survived because we had no choice. And now we are here because this was where they wanted us to be." A murmur surged through the room again, a ripple of disbelief mingled with awe. Some patrons shook their heads, still clinging to skepticism, while others stared at the children as though they were witnessing ghosts return to life. But Harold Preston's eyes filled with tears, and when he straightened, his voice carried not just his authority as an attorney, but the conviction of a man who knew the truth when it stood before him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone rising with quiet strength, "I am Harold Preston, senior partner at Preston, Winters & Hall, and I served as counsel to Richard and Victoria Montgomery for over 20 years. I drafted their wills myself, I witnessed their signatures with my own eyes, and I sealed their final instructions with my own hand. These children," he gestured firmly toward Eleanor and James, are indeed Eleanor and James Montgomery, the rightful heirs to the Montgomery estate. The document you see here bears my seal and my signature, and its authenticity cannot be questioned. The law recognizes their claim, and as of Eleanor's 7th birthday 3 days ago, full control of Montgomery Holdings legally passed into her hands. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps filled the room, phones shot into the air to capture every word, and whispers raced like wildfire from table to table. Some guests fumbled with their jewelry and ties, suddenly aware that they were no longer dining casually in luxury, but witnessing history unravel in real time. Others looked toward Whitfield, whose once proud posture had collapsed into a visible tremor. His face drained of color, his lips pressed tight as though he could physically hold back the flood that threatened to drown him. He opened his mouth, searching for words, but for the first time in decades no one seemed inclined to listen. Still, Whitfield could not surrender the battlefield of perception so easily. He slammed his palm against the nearest table, startling a waiter into dropping a tray. "This is madness," he bellowed, his voice cracking with panic beneath its fury. "You expect us to believe that 2 filthy children off the street suddenly appear with a scrap of paper and a sob story, and we're all supposed to kneel before them? No, this is a scam, orchestrated by Preston himself to seize control of assets that were meant for others. He's spinning lies to manipulate you all, and you're letting yourselves be blinded by a few piano notes and a tragic fairy tale." But the room no longer tilted toward him as it once would have. His companions avoided his eyes, unwilling to be tethered to his rage. Guests whispered about the uncanny resemblance between Eleanor and Victoria, about the way her small hands moved across the keys with the same elegance her mother had once displayed at private galas. They remembered the headlines, the mystery of the missing children, the unanswered questions about the yacht accident. And now, in this moment, those questions seemed to find their answers not in Whitfield's accusations, but in the quiet presence of the little girl who had silenced them all with her music. Eleanor did not rise to his anger. She did not shout or plead or argue. Instead, she pressed her brother closer against her side, her fingers returning once more to the keys. A melody rose again, but this time it was different, softer, gentler, as though it were written only for James. The notes fell like raindrops, soothing his small frame until he stopped trembling, his eyelids drooping with comfort. The audience, caught once more by the spell of her music, leaned forward, their skepticism dissolving into reverence. Preston seized the moment. "Mr. Whitfield," he said coldly, his voice sharp enough to slice through the last threads of Whitfield's control. "You speak of lies, but I recall that it was you who championed the acquisitions that sought to dismantle Montgomery properties in the wake of their presumed deaths. You stood to gain the most from their disappearance, did you not? Perhaps it is your fear of exposure that drives this desperate performance now." Whitfield's face darkened, his bravado unraveling into naked panic. "Careful, Preston," he hissed, his voice breaking. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of." "Oh, I have every idea," Preston replied smoothly, his composure now fully restored. "And I assure you the courts will have questions of their own once I present this letter. The children's testimony, and the evidence that will undoubtedly emerge now that they are back where they belong." The crowd stirred again, their whispers shifting into a tide of suspicion directed not at Eleanor but at Whitfield. Patrons who once hung on his every word now looked at him with narrowed eyes, recalling past dealings, half-remembered scandals, and rumors of his ruthless methods. The same people who had laughed at his cruel challenge minutes ago now recoiled from him, unwilling to share in his downfall. Eleanor lifted her hands from the piano and looked across the room with steady calm. She did not smile, but her gaze held a quiet power, the kind that did not need wealth or status to command respect. "You mocked us," she said softly, her voice carrying across the hall like the echo of her song. "You offered us scraps, but you had no idea who you were mocking. My brother and I have nothing, yet tonight we hold more than you ever will. Not because of money, not because of papers, but because we remember who we are." The words fell like a hammer on Whitfield's pride, and his body sagged as though struck. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted permanently. The hidden truth, the glittering chandeliers above Celestine seemed dimmer now, as though the brilliance that once illuminated power and wealth had turned inward, exposing the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. The air was thick with the murmur of speculation, the restless shifting of chairs, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes watching every flicker of expression on the faces of Eleanor Montgomery, Harold Preston, and Lawrence Whitfield. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of exclusivity and arrogance, now pulsed like the heart of a courtroom, and the judgment of the crowd pressed heavier with each passing second. Whitfield tried to regain his footing. His voice, once sharp and commanding, now quivered under the weight of doubt that clung to him. He gestured wildly toward the children as though their very presence offended him. "Do you not see? This is a fabrication, a clever stunt designed to distract from the truth. These children cannot possibly be the Montgomery heirs. They're vagabonds, strays plucked from the street to play a part in Preston's performance. And you—" He jabbed a finger at Eleanor, his eyes dark with fury. "You are nothing but a little liar trained to mimic what you should not know." But his words fell into a silence that did not welcome them. Too many people had seen the letter. Too many had heard Eleanor's name and watched her hands command the piano with a mastery no child of the street should possess. And above all, too many had recognized the unmistakable resemblance in her face, the Montgomery lineage etched in her eyes, her jaw, her very bearing. Whitfield's accusations rang hollow, like the desperate cries of a man cornered by truth. Harold Preston did not raise his voice, but when he spoke it carried with the weight of authority built over decades of service. "Mr. Whitfield, your desperation betrays you. You claim forgery, yet here I stand, the very man whose seal rests upon that letter. You claim fabrication, yet these children bear not only the name but the face and the spirit of the Montgomerys. And if further proof is needed, we will have it soon enough. DNA tests, medical records, personal accounts. Do you truly wish to test the courts with such reckless defiance?" The mention of courts sent a visible shudder through Whitfield's companions, many of whom now leaned away from him, unwilling to share in his impending ruin. His carefully constructed empire had been built not just on wealth but on perception, on the belief that he was untouchable. Yet tonight, in this gilded room, a child's melody and a single letter had stripped him bare before the world. Eleanor sat quietly at the piano bench, her brother's small hand nestled in her own. She had not moved since Preston's arrival, but her silence carried more strength than any outburst could have. Her eyes, calm and steady, flicked toward Whitfield as he faltered, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to speak. When she did, her words were soft but unyielding. "You call me a liar," she said, "but you know who I am. You knew it the moment you saw me. My parents trusted you once. They trusted many people who smiled and raised glasses in their company. But not all of those people were worthy of that trust. Some were greedy, some wanted what they had, and some would do anything to take it." A ripple of unease swept through the room. Whitfield's face blanched, his composure unraveling further. He sputtered, trying to find ground. "You dare accuse me? You, a child, dare—" Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "It was you, wasn't it?" she asked quietly, and her voice, though barely above a whisper, struck the room like thunder. "You were there that night. You knew the boat would not return. You wanted the Montgomery name gone so you could take everything they built, but you didn't count on us surviving." The audience gasped, their shock filling the air like a rising storm. Patrons leaned forward, hungry for revelation, their skepticism dissolving into outrage. Whitfield's lips parted, but no denial came quickly enough. His silence became its own confession. Harold Preston stepped closer to Eleanor, his eyes narrowing at Whitfield. "What boatman?" he asked, repeating the words James had blurted earlier. The boy stirred, his innocent face crumpling as he remembered. "The bad boatman," James said softly, his voice trembling. "He told us to be quiet, told us we'd see Mama and Papa again. But then there was fire, and water everywhere. We ran, we hid. He didn't look for us when we got away. He left us." Whitfield staggered back a step, his carefully rehearsed defenses crumbling. "Lies!" he roared, but his voice was hoarse, his body trembling with panic. The child is confused, traumatized. He doesn't know what he's saying. But the room no longer believed him. Too many threads now connected. The Montgomery fortune, the sudden acquisitions after their supposed deaths, Whitfield's visible terror, the letter, the children, and the half-remembered details of a tragedy that had never sat comfortably in the public's mind. Eleanor pressed her lips together, her hands once again finding the piano keys. This time she played no known melody but something raw, improvised, pulled straight from memory and pain. The notes rose like cries in the night, jagged and haunting, a musical picture of flames upon water, of terror in the dark, of children clinging to each other in the cold as the world they knew burned behind them. The audience sat frozen, some in tears as the music carried them into the children's past, into the suffering they had endured and the resilience that had carried them here. When the last note faded, Eleanor lifted her eyes once more and her voice was steady, filled with a weight no child should bear. We survived because the world tried to forget us, but we did not forget ourselves. And tonight we will not let you forget us either. The restaurant erupted, not in applause this time, but in a storm of voices, questions, accusations, and the flashing of cameras. Reporters who had been dining at nearby tables scrambled to call their editors. Guests uploaded videos that were already going viral, and the story of the lost Montgomery heirs spread like wildfire beyond the gilded walls of Celeststein. Whitfield stood at the center of it all, his empire collapsing not with the quiet erosion of time, but with the sudden implosion of truth. He tried to speak to regain control, but his words drowned in the tidal wave of outrage and disbelief. For the first time in his life, Lawrence Whitfield was not the man commanding the room. He was the man being judged. And Eleanor Montgomery, 7 years old and dressed in rags, was the one holding the gavel. The triumph and legacy, the storm that had gathered within the glittering walls of Celeststein finally broke, not with thunder or lightning, but with the quiet inevitability of truth pressing down on lies until they shattered. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant, from the youngest waiter to the most seasoned industrialist, now watched the unfolding drama not as passive observers, but as participants in history. They understood instinctively that this night would be remembered, written about, and spoken of for years to come, the night when a millionaire's mockery became his undoing and a child's song reclaimed a stolen destiny. Lawrence Whitfield stood trembling, his once proud shoulders hunched, his carefully polished facade slipping into ruin. His hands shook as though the weight of every accusation, every whisper of suspicion, every unspoken truth he had buried was now clawing its way to the surface. He looked not at Eleanor, not at Preston, not even at the crowd, but inward, as if the ghosts of his past had finally cornered him in the one place where wealth could not shield him. Eleanor remained at the piano bench, her brother leaning against her side, his small face buried in her torn dress, trusting her completely. She did not rise or gloat, did not shout or rage. Instead, she sat as her mother might once have sat in this very restaurant, with poise that belonged to a lineage of dignity and grace. Her silence spoke more loudly than Whitfield's roaring denials, and the audience leaned toward her, not him, as though the gravity of truth itself pulled them into her orbit. Harold Preston, his silver hair catching the chandelier's dying light, turned to Whitfield with the calm of a man who had already won. "Lawrence," he said, his voice steady and low, "it ends tonight. You may deny the children, but the world does not believe you anymore. You may scream about forgeries and lies, but I have the will, my seal, my records, and now living proof in these children's faces. You stood to profit from the Montgomerys' tragedy, and you believed their legacy buried with them. But here they stand, living and breathing, undeniable and stronger than you ever imagined. The courts will see it, the press will devour it, and your empire will crumble beneath it." Whitfield staggered, his breath coming fast and shallow. You can't prove anything," he muttered. But the strength in his voice had fled. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, sharper, filled with the venom of betrayal. Guests who once toasted him now looked at him with disgust, their memories flooding back. Rumors of shady dealings, suspiciously timed acquisitions, whispers of bribes and betrayals. He had been tolerated, even admired, so long as his power was unchallenged, but now that the mask had fallen, they saw him not as a titan of industry but as a parasite, fattened on the ruins of others. And then Eleanor lifted her hands once more to the piano keys. This time she played not the haunted cries of memory, not the trembling echoes of sorrow, but something soaring, powerful and luminous. Her fingers danced across the keys, weaving a melody that seemed to banish the darkness itself. It was music that carried the essence of survival, of hope, of triumph. It was the sound of children who had been abandoned but not defeated, mocked but not broken. The notes climbed higher and higher until they seemed to lift the very ceiling of the room, carrying the audience out of the shadows of greed into the light of possibility. When the final chord struck, the silence that followed was absolute, heavy with reverence. And then, slowly at first, the applause began, quiet, hesitant, as though the audience feared to break the spell. But it grew, swelled until it was a roar of thunder within the gilded hall. Guests rose from their seats, clapping, some with tears streaming down their faces, some cheering openly, their voices rising above the crash of hands. The applause was not for wealth or status, not for power or prestige, but for a 7-year-old girl who had walked into their world with nothing and reclaimed everything with dignity and grace. Whitfield crumpled into his chair, his head falling into his hands. He was finished, and he knew it. The applause was a eulogy for his reign, a funeral march for the empire he had built on deception and greed. No amount of money, no army of lawyers could erase the images flooding across the internet even now. Of Eleanor's defiance, of James's innocence, of Preston's confirmation, and of Whitfield's collapse. By morning, his name would be synonymous with corruption, his fortune dismantled piece by piece, his reputation beyond repair. Preston placed a hand gently on Eleanor's shoulder. "Your parents would be proud," he said softly, his voice breaking. "They wanted the world to know who you are, and tonight the world does." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes steady and bright. "I don't want their fortune," she said simply. "I only want my brother safe. I only want to remember them the way they wanted me to." The simplicity of her words struck the crowd harder than any grand speech could have. Here was a child with the weight of billions in her grasp, yet she asked for nothing but safety, memory, and dignity. It was a reminder to everyone present of the emptiness of their own indulgences, of the truth that wealth without humanity was nothing more than glitter on rot. Reporters swarmed now, questions spilling into the air like waves, but Preston raised a hand, his protective stance shielding the children. "There will be time for questions," he said firmly. "Tonight let them rest. They have already given more to this city than it deserves." The applause swelled again, and as Eleanor rose, guiding James to his feet, the crowd parted for them, forming a path through the opulence that had once excluded them. Patrons reached out not to jeer or dismiss, but to touch her shoulder, to whisper blessings, to bow their heads in respect. They had come as beggars, mocked and ridiculed, but they left as heirs, not just to fortune, but to something greater, the legacy of truth, resilience, and music that could silence even the cruelest voices. At the door, Eleanor paused and turned back once more to the piano. Her eyes softened, and for the first time that night a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "This place," she whispered almost to herself, "was always theirs. Now it will be ours again." And with that, she and her brother stepped into the night, leaving behind the ruins of Whitfield's pride and carrying with them the unshakable dignity of children who had faced the world's cruelty and emerged not as victims, but as victors.